Welcome to New Atlas Live. I'm Brian Berletic. Joining me, as always, is Angelo Giuliano. We're going to talk about the China protests, or in past tense, because it doesn't really seem like they're even taking place right now, except in the imagination of the anti-China forces across the West that were behind this. Angela, I think your YouTube is open.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. It's just
okay.
Yeah. Right. There's nothing happening. Actually, just to give you a scale, just some scale. China is 1.4 billion people. It's very hard to say how many people came into the streets, but really maximum, if you really stretch, maybe 10,000 over 50 cities.
Let's say across the whole country.
Across the whole country, and I think it's probably more like in a few thousand, but let's say 10,000. 10,000, that would mean, if you put that the scale of the United States, that would mean 4,000 over the whole country in 50 locations. If you make a calculation, it would be 50 locations, 80 people.
And Angela, we saw the footage, and you could see that it was like maybe 100 in Shanghai is like maybe 100, 200 people at most, if even. And they were doing the close camera angle so that you really couldn't gauge how big the crowd was. And that's a telltale sign that first of all, it's a Western sponsored agitation, and that they're trying to manipulate the public. Angelo, continue. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's of course, it's very important to say, well, there's a frustration in China. For good reasons. They've been in a semi-lockdowns. Not all China, but a few places they've had random lockdowns, and people are getting frustrated. They're losing a livelihood. People had business. It's damaging a lot of people's lives. But I want to add one thing. It's very important just to point out to people that are listening that we kind of neutral when it comes to COVID, because it's very people get antagonized. You have the pro-lockdown, pro-vaccine, and you have the anti-vaccine and so on, and we don't enter into this. But I just want to point out one thing which is really important. Just Chinese culture is very different. The way they approach the virus is very different. They had in 2003. They had they had SARS. SARS it would spread much, not as fast as COVID was. It didn't spread much, but the mortality rate was 11%. That was a nightmare for China. They got really, really scared. And in general, Chinese are very sensitive when it comes to virus. Average Chinese, whenever they get sick, the first thing they do is put a mask on. It's very counterintuitive. You might think that you put a mask to protect yourself from others. That's the opposite when it comes to China. Then there's something extremely important. ICU, intensive care units, the best that you have in the US is 35 per 100,000 people. In China is 3.6 beds per people in intensive care units. That means that if China would have dealt the same as the US did with the COVID, you would have probably 10 million people dying. In the US, you had 1 million. In China, because they didn't have the capacity to absorb many intensive care people, a lot of people would have died. They wouldn't be able to get into the hospital. They would have died in the street. It would be just a disaster. So this is why, it's really, really important just to put into the context. China is still a developing country. It didn't have the capacity for that. And then culturally, well, the government feels responsible, for the population. And overall, there's probably 80% of the population that actually support the zero COVID policy. But, there's a mounting frustration from people, and it's very normal. But again, I'm not... I don't want to go into the talk, vaccines, lockdowns, am I pro or against? I'm just telling, well, you need to look at the situation from the eyes of Chinese. And I want to add up one more thing is that, what did we discover in Ukraine? We discovered biolabs, and you've seen Peskov, Lavrov, they talked about this, and they say, in those biolabs, they were actually making some studies, targeting DNAs, trying to find the differences, between DNAs of Russians and Ukrainians. We're talking about bioweapons. China knows that, and somehow I think we need to trust somehow the Chinese government. I think behind that, those COVID lockdown, I mean, this zero COVID policy is, in case it's a test, in case of, like a bio warfare, they're really scared about this, because keep in mind, China is at war, the same as Russia. They are at war. It's been attacked in many. It's hybrid wars. It's been attacked on many different fronts. Terrorist groups have been financed in Xinjiang, the ETIM,
by the U.S. government,
by the
U.S. government.
The Dalai Lama, the separatist groups in Tibet have been financed since the 50s, 60s by the CIA. You have terrorist groups that are actually, in Pakistan, they're bombing a Belt and Road Initiative project. In Hong Kong, they try to do a colored revolution. So you see, this is within the context of a hybrid war that is waged against China. So China, it is very careful, and this is why when you see at all those attacks, now you do really understand why China is being closed. I mean, not for the COVID, but in terms of media, social media, why China did create this ecosystem that you don't have, Microsoft, I mean, all those big tech, they cannot penetrate China. So China is preserved in terms of sovereignty and for, it protects its national security. This is why, and this is actually a good example that other countries should do, because now your national sovereignty, it's not only about making sure you don't have agents on your soil, but also, you have penetration through social media. And what we saw these days in China, we saw clearly, some influence from outside China that actually tried to hijack those protests. It's very obvious, and we have lots of evidence.
Yeah. So actually, Angela, what you've done is give a very good overview of everything we're going to talk about in detail, which is good. So these protests, what I think is the West clearly was organizing them. We have seen the Telegram groups that they were using. They were full of Western journalists facilitating this, covering it, trying to blow it out of proportion, just like they do absolutely everywhere else. We have all of the evidence. We're going to show you all of the evidence of how this was. So there's obviously dissatisfaction. I've talked to people in Shanghai. I've had Andy Borum, who's in Shanghai, on the channel, talking about the lockdowns, how they were less than ideal, and how it does frustrate people. It is a disruption in people's lives. And again, whatever you want to say about COVID, it obviously affects certain people. And if it's happening on a widespread scale, you're going to have hospitals clogged. And even if it's just panic, people panicking and flooding the hospitals because they're panicking, that panic is real. Whatever you want to believe about everything else, that panic is real. It clogs the hospitals. It creates a real situation for society. And this a lot of governments had to react specifically just to that. And I've seen it myself here in Thailand. So it's frustrating. People are upset, but these protests, So first of all, let's see where are the protests right now. So I was just searching the news to see if there were anything going on now. And here's the Guardian. Winnie the Pooh joins Chinese COVID lockdown protests. Oh, in Tokyo. I don't think Tokyo's in China. I don't think that's in China. So the protests in China are over. And what the Western media is trying to do is just keep them going, keep the momentum going somehow, even if it's just covering these obviously US-funded groups, not even in China, acting up. This Winnie the Pooh character, this blank page. I want to talk about the blank paper. This was supposed to be the symbol of this, because every CIA color revolution has to have some kind of symbol. And I don't know, Angelo, if you have a different angle on this, but this seems to be the least imaginative yet. It's almost as if the CIA director said, guys, come back to me in an hour. Just put it on my desk, whatever the symbol or color is going to be. I don't care what, but it better be on my desk in an hour. They couldn't come up with something, and they put a blank page on his desk, And he's like, wow, oh my God, it's so brilliant. It
Well,
says everything without saying anything. Angela, what do you think about this?
It's nothing new. Actually, it's nothing new. They actually used the blank paper in 2019 US-backed protest in Hong Kong. So you see, actually in the Telegram channels, what you had the collusion between Western media. There's a list, short list, CNN, New York Times. There's a Radio Free Asia, which is part of the US AGM. You had even the sect of Falun Gong. So you had in the list of Telegram, in the Telegram channel, and actually that Telegram channels was centered into Shanghai. And I do think that they started from Shanghai and then it spread all over China. And it was mainly Shanghai and then universities, because it's easier. That's the strategy to touch students. But then when you see the contact list of the Telegram channels, within that list, you had some people, influencers, Chinese influencers from the diaspora. So you have some Chinese outside of China that have big Twitter accounts, big YouTube accounts, the anti-Chinese Communist Communist Party. And then you had within that list, who did we have? We had a dissident, which is actually working from US-backed NGOs, and that dissident was one of the organizers of 1989 Tiananmen Square event, which was a color revolution, one of the very first color revolution. Already back then, you had agents on the ground, and you had this collusion already with Western journalists. So what they do is that they organize, the organizer, they collude with the journalists, and they say, oh, you know what? We are going to do this protest, and just make sure that you gather, as many journalists with you, And in some cases, we saw it actually these days in Hong Kong. You had one protest in Hong Kong in Central, and you know how many protesters? You had maybe 12 protesters. You had 30 journalists. 30 journalists.
Yeah, exactly.
In Shanghai, that was probably about the same, a few hundreds. It's very rare that something like this happen. But, you just see, it was all a setup. If you are Chinese and you want to protest against the government, think about it. Why would you contact Western media? I mean, you have grievances against your own government. Well, you know what? You protest, and it's going to have an impact. But why do you have to get the attention of foreign media? Well, you need to create the buzz. That's the buzz, and that's actually fighting against your own government and your own country. I mean, those are traitors. Those are traitors.
Let's go over that point right there, Angela, because what I think is the Western media, it's the other way around. It's the Western media cultivating tiny groups inside China. They've got their little circles, and they got these people out, and they were told to stage this and to do it as widespread as possible. And it obviously collapsed because it was inorganic. It was fake. So let's take a look at this right here. BBC world journalist beaten, in quote marks, kicked and arrested during Shanghai protest over COVID. And he wasn't beaten, and it was a very tame arrest, and he was being disruptive, and he wasn't there to cover the news. He was there to make news, as all of these people at the BBC do. And it's not just the BBC, it's also Reuters, it's Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, CNN. They all do this, and they do this in absolutely every country. And if you've been following my channel, I've talked about how these exact same type of people are doing the exact same thing here in Thailand. Protests where there's more media than actual protesters, that is a very regular occurrence here in Thailand. I want to point out this excellent Grayzone article, and the links to all of this will be in the video description below. This is from the Grayzone, and it's titled Reuters, BBC, and Bellingcat participated in covert UK Foreign Office funded program to weaken Russia, leaked documents reveal. And this is about Reuters and the BBC, and Bellingcat is not a journalist organization. It's just a U.S. government-funded propaganda outlet. They don't even pretend. But Reuters and the BBC pretend to do journalism. but what they're actually doing is influence operations under the guise of journalism. They are involved directly in organizing opposition inside a targeted country, and also creating unrest, creating incidents to stir up unrest. And this is exactly what we caught them doing in China just over the last week. And I want to say, this is from the New York Times, 2011. This is them admitting they were behind the Arab Spring. So this is something the U.S. has done in the past on a massive scale. They targeted all of these countries across the Arab world. They admit in this article that the National Endowment for Democracy and all of its subsidiaries were involved in all of this. And this is what they were doing here in Southeast Asia that I've been covering for years. And this is what they just got caught doing in China. And I want to drive this point home. This is when I was still writing under a pen name. This was 2016. This is here in Thailand, this fake front called the Indochina Media Memorial Foundation, which was inside the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand's office, which was, run in part by the head BBC guy here, Jonathan Head. And they were caught taking money from Open Society and a bunch of other organizations also government organizations, Western government organizations, to do what? To do training programs, to train up a cadre of locals who will help amplify Western propaganda. And this is what they've been caught doing everywhere. So the Grayzone, this back in 2016, what the New York Times was admitting back in 2011, and this is what we saw in the Telegram groups in China just over the last week. Now, what was the other thing that they were claiming, Angelo? That one of the things was, China controls their internet so closely. So how could the West possibly have organized this? Because they've got their firewall and they've got, they censor everything. So how could the West? How is this not spontaneous? As if we're to believe this all just they have control over the internet and they weren't able to censor the protests happening in Shanghai, and that everyone just all at the same time decided to do this. And it's just a coincidence that Western journalists were at the middle of each one of these incidents. And I want to explain how the U.S. penetrates the information space of even a country like China with serious security measures to protect their information space. This is the Open Technology Fund. It is created by the U.S. government, right down here, U.S. Agency for Global Media. This is what you were just talking about, Angelo, Radio Free Asia. And these are all the projects. So they pour money into projects to allow agitators sponsored by the U.S. to circumvent security in a targeted nation's information space. So there's just page after page, VPN, messenger, file sharing services. If you go here, this is called oLINK, and this one's specifically targeting China. It says oLINK is a firewall circumvention open source tool set. It enables content providers from a free country like the US to target their audience in China. You see that's exactly what the US government was pouring money into, and that is the tool sets that these agitators sponsored and organized by the West in China did. And they fizzled because it was inorganic. People might be frustrated about China's zero COVID policy, but they're not going to destroy their own country as a response to it. They will find other ways to deal with it, not these U.S.-backed protests. So, Angelo, one last thing, and then we could go back to a discussion here. You were talking about the biolabs in and across Ukraine, how the U.S. was creating these labs and how there was suspicious projects involved in genome-specific biowarfare studies. And I want to show that it's not Russia or Angelo who is crazy. This is, people might remember, the Project for a New American Century. This was a neocon think tank. It's been rebranded and it's still around, but it's just been rebranded under various different names. It's a report of the Project for a New American Century, September 2000. And it's called Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century. And let me find where I was writing about this, right here. Again, the link is in the video description below. Let me read this. It says, the proliferation of ballistic and cruise missiles and long-range unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, will make it much easier to project military power around the globe. Munitions themselves will become increasingly accurate, while new methods of attack, electronic, non-lethal, and biological, will be more widely available. That's interesting. And it gets worse. Although it may take several decades for the process of transformation to unfold, in time, the art of warfare on air, land, and sea will be vastly different than it is today. And combat likely will take place in new dimensions, in space, in cyberspace, which Angela and I were just talking about, in China, and perhaps the world of microbes. And then this is the part that is the most disturbing. It says, advanced forms of biological warfare that can target specific genotypes may transform biological warfare from the realm of terror to a politically useful tool. So they are talking about genospecific bioweapons being a politically useful tool. These are the same people who engineered the invasion of Iraq, the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, and this ongoing conflict between the US and China, the refusal of the US to allow China to surpass the United States, despite having a bigger industrial base, larger population, better infrastructure. These people talking about genospecific bioweapons are talking about, these are the same people involved in the current tensions between the US and China. So that's it in black and white. And if you don't believe me, just look in the video description. It's in there. It's archived because this isn't up anymore, but it's archived on Wayback Machine. And you can read the whole paper. It's very disturbing. And you can see how a lot of the things they talked about have actually come to pass. And a lot of people don't know about this, that biotechnology is extremely advanced right now. They have the ability to take a virus, reprogram it. Instead of it injecting its genetic material into your cells to make copies of itself, they can inject genetic material into your cells to do a whole host of things. Good things like defeating cancer, for example. But also very bad things. So these are all things that no one talks about that are a reality right now. And this is something that China has. So we don't know what the truth is behind China's zero COVID policy. China is a very pragmatic country. They're sticking with the zero COVID policy seemingly stubbornly, but there might be, I'm not saying this is the reason, but I'm putting this out as something that genuinely exists as a threat that China might be taking into consideration in its overall calculus. Angela?
No, absolutely. I agree with you. So it explains, because a lot of people seeing from outside, let's say I don't know anything about China. I see from outside. I mean, average Joe will think, how authoritarian, it's authoritarian, it looks like dystopian, but it's not, it's just, but from the outside, you see those guys all dressed in white, all those precautions. But if you start to understand that, what China has gone through, that China is actually not prepared for a massive outbreak, now it's not as lethal. Keep in mind that now, the new variants are not as lethal as the beginning. But if it was as the same as the beginning, with the Chinese capacity to tackle the virus, in terms of ICU, China would have 10 million people dying. And I tell you that what would ensue to this would be complete chaos. The government would not survive this. 10 million people dying. And so this is why you have a government which needs to be accountable. It is responsible. But you know what? Who likes lockdown? Do you think Chinese government? They're giving up, people's freedom, GDP growth and so on. But that's a minor evil. You had all the choices are bad. That's a minor evil. And they put people first. That is very cultural too.
And if China scrapped the zero COVID policy and large numbers of people were dying, then the West would go on about this. And then the West would try to stir up protests about everybody dying. These are all things that the West are doing. They don't care. They don't care about the Chinese people. Look what they're doing to Ukraine right now. They are destroying that country down to the last brick to fight a proxy war against Russia. They don't care about the Ukrainian people. When they write about it, U.S. funded think tanks are talking about what a bargain this proxy war is, how they're defeating the Russian military for such a bargain in terms of U.S. investment. And nowhere in that calculation that they're doing to figure out what a bargain it is do they put in the numbers of Ukrainians dying, the amount of damage being done to the economy and to the infrastructure. None of that factors in. And when it comes to destroying China, they have the same ruthless disregard for human life. They don't care what happens to people. And again, I see maybe a little bit of a debate in the comment section about COVID. None of us know the truth. I don't have my own lab and a team of researchers looking into it. I don't know what the truth is. I can't say for sure. The best that we can do is look at what different countries are doing, countries that are opposed to each other, and yet they're still doing certain things in common. I saw here with my own eyes here in Thailand, whatever the truth is about this virus, people were panicking because of the media. And that was something the West was stirring up deliberately, panic. And people in a panic were flooding hospitals. And this was something that the government had to react to calm people down. They were setting up improvised temporary hospitals to move people into so that they wanted to go someplace where they felt safe and they weren't blocking up a hospital that actual people with real injuries or sickness had to go to. So it was a problem that every country faced. China has the largest population on Earth, 1.4 billion people. Think about how many people that is. That's the same population as the United States plus an extra billion people. Just think about that. So keep all of this in mind. Let me see. Let me see if there's some comments here, some questions, and we want to talk about Taiwan also. So this was the main topic. We want to talk about these protests in China. They're already over. So if there was something really upsetting the Chinese people and they were coming out, we saw the police. They weren't doing anything. They were just standing there. In the US, in Australia, anti-lockdown protests, they were clubbing people. They're saying you have to wear a mask, you have to lock down, or you might get sick and die. And they're clubbing these people in the head. Like how does clubbing them in the head keep them safe and healthy? I don't understand. But that was what was going on in the West. I did not see that going on in China. Angela, is there anything else you want to say about these protests?
Well, in Canada, Trudeau, they were calling neo-Nazis, the far right. They actually seized assets. Do you know that they seized assets because they were protesting? And I tell you, they were clubbing people. I mean, they were like so brutal. Tell me, in China, not much, maybe a few scratches. But the thing is that, what they did in China, those protesters, they were, in those telegrams channel, they were actually exchanging the playbook of the color revolution. So in those playbook, they tell you how you have to interact with the police. So you have to provoke them, and you have to make sure that there's to be violent enough so you have a violent reaction. Why do you need this clash? Is that they are at the stage that they need content, visual content, and when they have those visual content, they're going to amplify and share it with Western media. So you have this vicious circle, of there's violence. We are going to be more violent. And you see, what they staged outside China was actually bigger than what happened in China.
Yes.
They used
who are those people, Angelo? Who are those people, Angelo? To people who are not familiar. Simple. Nathan Law, for example.
Nathan Law is financed by the US. He's actually working, I think he's in Washington now or in England. But he's actually, or is he working for, I think he's, one of those NGOs that actually was working for regime change in Hong Kong, Color Revolution. So you have the pro-independence Hong Kongese. You had the Taiwanese, DPP that are helping out, and you have a pro-Tibetans groups. You have the Xinjiang ETIM groups, and they're staging protests all around the world. And they're trying, actually, it's very interesting because they're trying to get Chinese to join that protest. But Chinese, they're patriotic, because of education here, people are really patriotic. They love their country. So you have those clashes. I have lots of videos where you have those clashes of Chinese living abroad with those people that are actually protesting for the condition in China, COVID conditions, which, by the way, they don't care. What they're just seeing those protests in China as being an opportunity to stir up, something like a worldwide condemnation. So you have those clashes of Chinese outside of China that are actually, because they see what is behind this is, the ultimate goal is regime change and Balkanization of China, the same as what they're trying to do. In Russia, they're more advanced. They've made a map of what they are going to change. Even maybe they might give some land. Sakhalin, they're going to give it to Japan. Maybe they're going to share. Take all the resources of the country and Balkanize the country. And they had meetings. I think it was in Poland or in Czechia, where you had this already government in exile, where you had the chess master. I forgot Kasparov. Kasparov. Yeah, in all those guys that they work with the that forum, the Oslo
Freedom Forum, which the BBC admitted it's funded by the U.S. State Department, the Foreign Office of the UK, and this is what they do. They train agitators to go back to their respective countries and overthrow the government. Now, these are comments that this is what makes me sometimes feel like I'm talking to a wall. Trudeau calling protesters Nazis and you all calling protesters CIA is the same thing, same tactic. Well, I don't know if Trudeau showed the evidence of what he was accusing people of, but we showed the evidence, and you saw for yourself. A country of 1.4 billion people, 100 people came out, and like Shanghai is a massive city. It's like over 20 million people, and like 100, 200 people came out, and they were all holding hands with the BBC, Radio Free Asia. What do you call that if not CIA? And again, we have to go back to this because this is something people will continuously say. This is the New York Times admitting that the National Endowment for Democracy, which took over regime change promotion from the CIA, admittedly, this was them admitting that they were behind the Arab Spring, that they were training these people years in advance, and they're doing the exact same thing in China. They're doing the same thing here in Thailand. This is why I started talking about geopolitics. I saw it with my own eyes. I witnessed it. I saw them burning the city down around me. Angelo does this because he saw them doing it in Hong Kong where he lives. So we're not imagining this. And the West admits that they're doing this. They try to spin it as if they're doing everyone a big favor, but this is something that they admittedly are doing. We're not imagining this, and we're not calling them CIA agents. And look, it's possible that some people saw the protests, felt upset about what was going on, and they joined them. But it doesn't matter what they think. It only matters what is really going on. If the U.S. is trying to stir up, divide, and destroy China, it doesn't matter what people in their head think they're out there protesting for. It only matters why they actually are out there protesting and who's directing it and to what end. Because I heard these same arguments since 2011, the Arab Spring, Libya. I had people saying, "Oh, Brian, Gaddafi's so horrible. This could only improve things for Libya." Look at Libya now. Look at Ukraine. I heard the exact same things because from the beginning in Ukraine, I didn't just start covering Ukraine in February. I was covering Ukraine since the protests in 2014. And people said, "Oh, the government's so corrupt. It could only get better from here." Did it? No, it didn't. So I have the same conversation with people for years and years. So if I seem curt and short-tempered with people like this, that is the reason. I've watched this mentality literally destroy one country after the other over the last 10 to 20 years. So I have no patience for it. Angela, how do you feel when we lay out all of the facts? You see what are the chances this is a spontaneous protest and the BBC just so happened to be there? What are the chances?
No, absolutely.
And in the Telegram groups organizing it before they came out on the streets. What are the
chances? Exactly. Actually, in the Telegram group, I want to exchange just a few messages that we saw in the Telegram group. You had at some point, you had even protesters being paid. Actually, one mentioned 200, but I couldn't make up what was it, like 200 RMB. That would be very cheap, or $200. So basically, there's one guy who's saying, "Are you going there?" And the other guy is like, "What? For only 200? No, no way I'm going there for 200." And that's one example, I'm not saying, probably you have some people genuinely, they really went there because they're upset. Some people lost their business because of COVID lockdown. And then you had other cases. You even had a picture of a foreigner, a big fat guy. I don't know if I shared that with you, Brian, but they're saying, well, this is the organizer. This is they call him the director.
Yes.
So basically, people, they would actually look for that director for directions. And then, you had in the Telegram group, you had actually, the manual how to make petrol bombs.
Yeah. And the CIA guide how to organize color revolution. Here's another comment that we hear all the time. Brian, can we not be anti-color revolution while not being pro-authoritarian medical tyranny? Did you just see me show you the U.S. government insiders producing a policy paper talking about genospecific bioweapons, how it's a politically useful tool? Did you not just see me show you that? And do you not understand the implications of that, and why a nation like China or other nations across Asia, why they would be reacting this way? And did you not see hospitals being overloaded? I have two sons. I had a son who had a blood infection, which is a serious, urgent medical condition that needs to be addressed immediately. And this was at the height of the hysteria because of the media panicking people. And we were not able to get into the hospital and get him taken care of immediately like he needed to. Luckily, he did get treated and in time, but we were waiting all day when this is something that would have otherwise been done immediately. And it was because people were panicking. This is in Thailand, a country that is much more laid back, much smaller population. Things are much more manageable than in China, where there's 1.4 billion people. Imagine you're in Beijing. That's what you're in charge of, 1.4 billion people across a country the size of almost the size of a continent. How much more there is to deal with there. It is not. So I understand people chafe at the idea of being told what to do, and they have their suspicions about this. Like I said, nobody knows what the truth is. We don't have our own labs, our own teams of doctors to look into this and give us a 100% independent report on what is really happening. But we can see that there are actual dangers. We do know that the West has lied to us about an awful lot. We know that there's, the institutions in the West reacting to this cannot be trusted, should not be trusted, and abused their power. But we're not talking about the West. We're talking about China, a country that is actually taking care of their people. I've been to China. Angelo lives in China. We know that China, the government is taking care of the people. We can see it. It's evident. So no, I don't see. We know it's a color revolution. We know it's fake. We know the people joining were organized by Western journalists. So how could we be supporting them? There's no way to support them.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. I mean, one thing that we have in common, you and I, Brian, is that we are not ideology driven in a sense that, we don't care about those labels. Actually, we are against labels. Well, socialist, all this BS, really, this is a good way just to divide people, and we're not interested in this. And additional to that, we're not interested into pro. We're not going to the discussion pro-vaccine, against vaccine, pro-lockdown. What we are doing here, and every time that's what we do in all our videos, is actually, pointing out sovereignty. Why? Because if you believe in democracy, demokratos in Greek, power to the people. That means sovereignty and self-determination. If you don't have that, you don't have the foundation of democracy. And everybody that is saying, well, we want democracy, we want whatever, if you don't have that, that's the foundation. After that, what people choose and how they manage their country, that's not our business. Is that my business? Even if I live in China, you know what? That's not my business. It becomes my business. I'm not Chinese, but it becomes my business. You know what? When there is meddling. Yeah. When there's meddling, what we pointing out all the time, when there is meddling, what we want is peace in the world, a multipolar world, and every country the people can have their manage that with their own destiny. That's all. The rest If you want to divide us, because I know once you touch COVID, you are going to have hyenas. How do you call them? Hyenas from both sides. They'll be like, they'll be like crazy. I don't care.
Yeah, there's extremists on both ends of the spectrum who you simply cannot talk to about this topic because they're just way too extreme on both sides.
We had the same with Anwar Ibrahim. Anwar Ibrahim. I know that lots of ethnic Chinese, they're for Anwar Ibrahim. We know that, and they were actually supporting us on everything. But then they say, no, Malaysia, no. Why? Because it wasn't convenient, because Anwar Ibrahim somehow now is actually supporting ethnic Chinese in Malaysia. No, well, you know what? We are consistent. That's a good example to show you that we are not for one ethnicity, one country or not. We are pointing out that people, we need to get out of those systems of imperialism, or what we call the new neo-colonialism. Those countries, they are adults. Let them rule. Let them manage their own country, give the power to the people everywhere. We have enough problems in our own Western societies. I mean, how can we define democracy or system democratic? That's hilarious. It's not. You get a choice of pre-selected two people, two clowns. You have Trump and you have Biden. Two clowns. Don't ask me to be for one or the other. I laugh, we laugh about this. I mean, we joke about this, you and I, of those people. Oh, I'm pro-Trump and I'm pro-Biden. You know what? You are just being fooled by a system that is divided and control people. That's how it is, And the more it shows you that they are divided, the more it gives you the illusion of democracy. So I think it's important, especially after what we had, with Anwar Ibrahim. We had people supporting us for everything, but Anwar Ibrahim, they were like for years, and then Anwar Ibrahim, no. But I'm not taking side, just pointing out this guy is a pure product from the West. That's all. He's been financed. He says it himself. He's like, I'm happy to be part of NED. I'm like, what other evidence? I'm not, he says it himself.
We showed a picture of him literally in Washington doing a group photo with the top leadership of the National Endowment for Democracy. And in my video that I did after that, to kind of summarize everything, I was talking about how NED President Carl Gershman did this introduction of Anwar Ibrahim before he spoke at yet another NED event in 2019. And he was like listing all of the things that he had been doing with the NED over all of these years, how deeply involved he's in all of it. And I still had people in the comment section, what's your evidence that Anwar Ibrahim is, well, maybe he was just tricking them. I mean, this is delusional thinking, and people have to stop. When the facts touch something that makes you uncomfortable, you have to ask yourself why despite the facts, you're still going to go and push this. Now, Angelo, you said something really important, and I get people saying this to me, and they're clearly Westerners or people who do not live in China, and it's kind of like that comment that I had just read about, China is this dictatorship, and it's a medical dictatorship and everything. If you don't live in China, it's none of your business. Let China deal with their country the way they want to. That is, if you're anti-imperialism, but then you're still trying to pass judgment on another country and their system, a country you've never even been to. Because I remember when I first went to China, all of the things that people had told me about China is just evaporated. The minute I got there, it evaporated. We've talked about this many times. Just go there and see for yourself, and you will understand it. It's not nearly as bad as what you're being told. Even with the controls now, it's not as bad as some people are depicting.
No, and then I think there's a survey by Howard University. I mean, it says clearly that 95% of Chinese are satisfied with their system, and they compare with the US, 38%. Yes. The thing is that it's very counterintuitive. It's not you putting a ballot, to vote, electing someone. That doesn't make it democratic. It's the system to deliver and to bring satisfaction, people to be happy about that system. Ultimately, from my experience, and I wouldn't want that for my country, but from my experience, it's probably one of the most democratic systems in the world. It's just that people don't take the time to understand it. That's all. You have 80, 90 million of Chinese that are part of the CPC. So you have a system of selection and election. But keep in mind that when you have 80, 90 million people that are part of the CPC, then you have the family extended and so on. We are talking about, think about you're part of the CPC. Then you have, you influence around you in your family, you have 5, 6 people. I mean, that's extremely representative of the population, really. But again, it's not like in China, you would never have an actor like Zelensky to be elected, because it's meritocracy. You wouldn't have a mayor like Klitschko who's do boxing and manage a city. No, it's not the way it works, because it's because your capacity. First, the capacity so you can enter into the system and you deliver result and you can climb up the ladders of the power. And that's actually inspired by 2000 of years of political history, where you had the Mandarin that had to take extremely difficult exams, and then they could actually have be managing regions or like counties and so on.
I'm trying to find the comment. It was a perfect segue into our next topic about Taiwan.
Yeah. Well, let's not forget, we need to touch Taiwan, because that's a very important topic.
This is a major, and it's directly related too, because we hear all of these narratives about how the people in Taiwan, they want nothing to do with this brutal dictatorship on the mainland, and how it's an independent country, when in no conceivable way is. Even the most adamant separatists on the island of Taiwan, their government is actually called the Republic of China. People say Taiwan is not China. It's literally called the Republic of China. So it is part of China. Is not an independent country. Well, I can't find it. It was a good segue. But anyway, let's just go to this article. First of all, as you were talking, Angelo, about democracy, I just want to show people this. If you take 10,000, which is about how many people were at these protests across all of China, and you divide it by the total population, you see you're not even a minuscule fraction of 1%. Let's just say 100,000 people came out. I mean,
it was probably a few thousand. It was not even 10,000. It was probably maybe a couple of thousand over the whole country.
The whole country.
I know. It's just ridiculous. And China is not even a country; it's a continent. At the scale, it's 3 times the size of Europe. Really. It's absurd. It was absurd, make it to the international news. There was a known event. Actually, you would ask any Chinese about protests, they'd be like, what protest? What are you talking about?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people who saw the protests came out of curiosity to see what was going on. And also, there are protests all the time, all across China. Angela, you make this point all the time. And if you really dig into the news, you will learn about these protests. Chinese people are allowed to protest, and they protest often. But they protest in a very pragmatic way. It's just like here in Thailand. There's a lot of genuine protests here, and they're not out to create a problem. They're just out to get some exposure for their whatever it is that they're concerned about, and then they talk with the government, and they try to make a compromise so that everyone gets what they want, and so that things move onward more smoothly. And it's a U.S.-backed mob, U.S.-backed agitators, when the goal is to just disrupt, divide, and destroy. That's when because that doesn't suit anyone's. So even if you think these people have genuine gripes about the way China's managing its healthcare system, it's this health crisis, whatever you want to call it, going out into the street and demanding the government disperse, calling for regime change, that is not going to fix anything. As history has proven, the U.S. has done this to country after country, destroying them. So anyway, let's talk about Taiwan. Again, another place where we keep hearing from the West, and people who buy into the Western media, and even people who think they're against the Western media, but they buy into these kind of, I would probably more right-wing alternative media, but they're not actually alternative media. They're pushing establishment talking points through what looks like alternative media. They're all big supporters of Taiwan and independent Taiwan. And yet there was this election. It says Taiwan president quits as party head after China threat bet fails to win votes. This is Reuters admitting this. It must have been a pretty heavy blow. Angel, can you explain to people what's going on in Taiwan? What was Tsai Ing-wen of the Democratic Progressive Party trying to tell voters, and what did voters tell her?
Well, those were elections at the local level, so not that important. They have elections every 2 years. So you have this time it's local elections, and in 2 years, in 2024, it's going to be the new legislative council and the president. And in 2 years, that would be much more important. But Tsai Ing-wen, before those local elections, he said this is going to be a vote of confidence. This will tell. It's like a referendum. She says, well, this will tell you how popular I am, and it's clearly a vote of no confidence. If you look at the popular vote, in terms of percentage, the Kuomintang and KMT and DPP, KMT got 10% more than the DPP. So it's a huge defeat for the DPP. The reason that actually she didn't get that support is that she's been focusing too much on international scene and creating frictions with China, because she invited Pelosi to Taiwan, and this is a huge problem for the fact that Taiwan is officially part of China, and they know that China is not going to be happy about this. So Taiwanese, they saw that she was stirring up problem, and she was not taking care of ultimately what she's supposed to do. Take care of Taiwanese well-being. I mean, why are you just stirring up problems? And again, China, we've said it all along, China, the trade, import and export of Taiwan is 50% with China. Why would you destroy those ties? And I want to point out, we mentioned this before, Tsai Ing-wen, she's kind of the replica of Juan Guaido for Venezuela, or Zelensky for Ukraine. She doesn't work for the interest of Taiwanese. I back it up. WikiLeaks cables, there's plenty of cables, WikiLeaks, you type WikiLeaks, Tsai Ing-wen, and AIT. What is AIT? It's American Institute of Taiwan. That's the de facto US embassy in Taiwan. In 2005, already, she was having secret meetings with AIT, feeding them information about internal politics, the DPP, and so on. So she has been selected very early on to be by the US to be voted in ultimately by the people. And you can see it's very interesting. You know what they do when they select you? They put you on Time magazine. Do you think it's a coincidence that Anwar Ibrahim was on Time magazine before being, they propped him up before, and then he got the support internally. The same Tsai Ing-wen, she was not actually once on Time magazine. I think she was maybe 2 or 3 times. She's the new face of democracy in Taiwan. So yeah.
Well, we've talked about how she was talking. She was rising up in the Democratic Progressive Party. She was in constant contact with U.S. representatives in the fake U.S. Embassy, the American Institute of Taiwan, because there is no real embassy, because the U.S. does not officially recognize Taiwan as a country. They recognize it as part of China. And then in, I think it was 2014, same time as the Umbrella Revolution in Hong Kong that the U.S. was also sponsoring, there was the Sunflower Movement in Taiwan. And they admit that first of all, they had the same type of connections, not only with the U.S.-backed mobs in Hong Kong, but also themselves directly connected to U.S. support. And then they were trying to transform politics in Taiwan, and they were trying to get the Democratic Progressive Party into power in 2016. They did. And we watched the island of Taiwan unravel, just like Ukraine did after the 2014 Euromaidan. And just like everywhere, a U.S. proxy gets into power and starts irrationally cutting their ties with their closest allies and partners, and pivoting toward the US, no matter how irrational. We've talked about this many times about Taiwan.
Brian, I want to add one thing. You mentioned, actually, it's very interesting, that coincidence. In 2014, you had two things. You had the Maidan Revolution, so the US poured in $5 billion just, to overthrow the government. But then, why this happened back then was because Yanukovych was balanced, was not even pro-Russia or pro-EU. Exactly. But he had two deals. He had one deal was the EU, and EU wasn't going to give much. And you had another deal of free trade with Russia, and Russia was going to put $15 billion on the table to help, to rescue Ukraine, because Ukraine was collapsing. So you had those free trade agreements. In Taiwan, in 2014, there was a free trade agreement to be signed between China and Taiwan. It was unique. Actually, there was a slow integration, de facto integration of the two economies. And then you had those NED, US backed up protesters. They actually went pour in the streets. And actually what they did, they took over the Legislative Council, which is, the name is Legislative Yuan. That's the council there. You had the protesters going there and occupying the Legislative Council. I mean, so much for democracy. I mean, really, the same as they did in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong in 2019, they replicated what was done in Taiwan. And you see, because of that, you had that relationship. 2014 and 15 was the best time between Taiwan and China in terms of relationship. You even had the president back then, Ma Ying-jeou, who met with Xi Jinping in Singapore. They met, they shake hands, and the relationship was extremely good. But then everything destroyed.
Yeah, this is important for people to understand. Before Tsai Ing-wen and the Democratic Progressive Party came into power in 2016, Taiwan was on the path to incremental, very, very a slow process, and done when it made sense. Taking the next step when it made sense for both the rest of China and Taiwan. There was a process of reunification taking place, and it was beneficial to Taiwan. And this is why the U.S. stirred up the Sunflower Movement in the first place. This is why they were anxious to get Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP into power. And then since then, she's been undoing all of this. She's been undoing all of these things that were being done to reunify Taiwan with the rest of China, which was directly benefiting Taiwan economically. And I want to show this, and we show this every single time. This is where Taiwan exports to. The rest of China, about 50%. And imports, right here, the rest of China is where Taiwan imports most of what it needs. And these are essential raw materials for its semiconductor industry and its electronic component manufacturing. And these are their main industries. And if for some reason Tsai Ing-wen was successful, the DPP was successful in pushing for separatism from the rest of China, their economy would implode. And there's absolutely nothing the United States could do to give an alternative to Taiwan. It's right off the coast of the rest of China. What would they possibly do to help fill in that void? There's nothing. It's just like Ukraine. Ukraine is right on the border with the EU, and yet they cannot do anything to help Ukraine after they irrationally cut all of their industry, economic, trade ties with Russia. Their economy just started spiraling downward. And there was nothing the rest of the EU and the US could do for them. And there's certainly nothing they could do for Taiwan. So we talk about this all the time. I thought the elections were a bit of a surprise because the US admittedly is dumping money into the internal politics of Taiwan to shape people's perception and to get them to vote irrationally for the DPP and against the best interests of the people living there on that island. If you're voting in people who are going to destroy your economy, how does that benefit you? It doesn't. And so this is where democracy suffers tremendously when you have large numbers of people voting for the top leader. They don't understand all of these topics and these issues, and then they vote in somebody like Tsai Ing-wen or Zelensky or whoever these people are supporting Juan Guaido. So these are things that we all have to take into consideration. But then they did have this election, and people voted overwhelmingly against the DPP, and specifically because she has been on this anti-China bend for all of these years, and they can see the economy already. It's already unraveling. Angelo, you know a lot about Taiwan. You've actually been there. And the economy of Taiwan, since Tsai Ing-wen, they were trying to reverse, the DPP were trying to reverse all kinds of deals, uproot investment from the mainland. And this has actually been having a big impact on the day-to-day lives of people living on the island, right?
Yeah, well, I was actually living in Taiwan. I was studying in Taiwan 27 years ago, so in 1995. And actually, you would ask any Taiwanese back then, they would all say, they're Chinese. They would say, I'm Chinese living in Taiwan. That's what was the rule back then. But since the DPP got into power with there was actually the first one was Chen Shui-bian, was actually the mentor of Tsai Ing-wen. Since then, 2003, 2004, they started changing the history books. So, that's how you start. You start with the kids, telling those kids that the history of Taiwan didn't belong to the history of China. 4,000 years of history, the connection of Taiwan very early on. But what they say in those books is that the history of Taiwan starts only in 1949. When you had the civil war in China, you had the Kuomintang and the communists, and you had the Kuomintang living to Taiwan, and they were protected by the US. And that's how they start their history books. So kids in Taiwan, they see that history starting in 1949. And so it's really important. When we see Tsai Ing-wen, we need to understand that how did she get elected in 2020? She actually leveraged what was happening in 2019 in Hong Kong. She had back then, just before the riots in Hong Kong, she had 35% of support. Because of the riots, and because actually the DPP was actually meddling to Hong Kong, they were supporting the riots in Hong Kong. Because of that, she went from 35% of support to 60% of support. So my fear when it comes to the next election of 2024 is that they might actually do something similar. Because if the Kuomintang, KMT, takes power in 2024, the whole plan of the US to antagonize China and Taiwan and to lead Taiwan towards some kind of independence, which would lead to war, this whole plan would fall apart. So we need to really pay attention from now to the next election in 2024. That's very critical. This is going to define not only the relationship between Taiwan and China, but again, maybe a potential third World War III.
Yeah, and I really have very minimum hope regarding these elections, because I think the comment that I wanted to put on the screen was asking about, will the U.S. give up now? No, they're going to double down. They're going to dump even more money into the internal political affairs of Taiwan. They're going to try to boost Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP even more. They're going to do a more thorough job uprooting any sort of media in Taiwan that is getting in the way of this narrative that the U.S. wants to impose on the people living there. I mean, don't you think that it's interesting how you see all of these people, all of the, they call themselves China watchers. I call them China haters. They hate China. They fear China. They're insecure. They see that China is surpassing the West. This makes them upset. This is what drives their hatred. It's irrational hatred too. And they claim that they care so much about Taiwan and they just want the best for the people there. But this election is a wake-up call that the West is trying to impose on Taiwan, the idea that they're somehow separate from the rest of China. This is artificial. This is as artificial as the West claiming Ukraine has nothing to do with Russia. It's ridiculous. And it will only end in tragedy if they push this, it goes full circle and they get their way. So yeah, they're going to double down. And like you said, Angelo, if by miracle, the people living on the island are looking at what's going on in Ukraine, and they realize that they're being led off a cliff, and they decide to show the DPP the door and get back on track to an incremental win-win process of reunification, which is not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen slowly, surely, step by step. and it's going to take the considerations of people on both sides of the strait, and that will be back on track, and then things can get back to peace, prosperity, stability. You cannot have peace, prosperity, and stability if, like you said, Angelo, we're waiting for Taiwan to become the epicenter of World War III. Cannot invest in an environment like that. You cannot start a business in an environment like that. And this is what's been going on in Taiwan since Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP have gotten into power. It's the courtesy of the U.S. You have anything else you want to add to this, Angelo?
Yeah, just one more thing is that, again, we talk about reunification, but the thing is that the concept of reunification that China wants for Taiwan is actually not much change. What they want to do is a one country, two system. So basically, Taiwan could keep exactly the same system it has. No change, to the extent that Taiwan could even keep its armed forces. It's just in a facade, it's just a matter of pride, and territorial integrity for China is essential. And it's this reintegration of Taiwan would actually end this, what they call the century of humiliation. So it would be under one country, two system. So extremely autonomous. And actually they wouldn't have any representative of mainland Beijing to go to Taiwan. They would actually have the opposite. Taiwanese representative to be integrated into Beijing, so Taiwanese would have a say into the whole China's politics. So nothing would change. It's the same as Hong Kong. I was here in 97. I was before in 95, before the handover of Hong Kong. And now, 35 years later, nothing has changed. Absolutely nothing. It's exactly the same. China doesn't say much. The only thing that China wants is sovereignty, territorial integrity. That's all they're asking. They don't want any foreign meddling. That's all home. And that's all they're asking. So again, I think it's important if Taiwanese are listening now. It's just just think for 1 second. If you are Taiwanese, think for 1 second. Do you think that Americans care more for you than Chinese? If you do that,
well,
stop taking drugs. Stop taking drugs.
Here's a good comment that kind of fleshes out how much the U.S. cares about Taiwan. They're moving the semiconductor industry out of Taiwan into the United States so that they can, with an entirely free, unburdened mind, turn Taiwan into a proxy to use against China, exactly the way they're using Ukraine against Russia. This is their whole plan. They're doing it openly. They're taking everything of value off of the island. Do you think that the semiconductor industry in Taiwan is going to be more or less viable when it's moved to the United States? It's obvious. Everyone involved knows that it will be much less viable. They're doing this because they plan to feed Taiwan into the wood chipper feet first, just like they're doing to Ukraine. I'm sorry for the crude metaphor, but I want to express how horrific it is what the U.S. is doing, what they're doing to Ukraine, and what they plan to do to Taiwan. And they're doing it so openly. And the veneer of sincerity and concern that they claim that they have for Taiwan, it is so paper thin. I mean, you just see right through it. It's transparent. And hopefully more and more people see this and understand this, that the U.S. is not on your side. They're going to use you, and they're going to spend every drop of your blood and every penny of your treasure advancing their own objectives at the expense of you. That's what they do. That's what they've always done. And that is what they're doing right now. Let's see. I think that is about it. Angela, any last thoughts on either the protests that are now over in China? I mean, if it was really the Chinese people were totally fed up. I mean, they protest every year about all kinds of things. If they were truly fed up, wouldn't these protests still be going on? How come it was a flash in the pan? And not even really, because the West built it up much bigger than it actually was. Do you want to talk any last thoughts on that or the situation in Taiwan?
I think they're trying to build a traction internationally, so to get some support. It's part of the demonization of China. There's the U.S. Congress, they signed a bill of $500 million per year on building negative coverage about China. Just think about how much people you can buy. Media, people, you just buy, an average article is probably $500, They could actually pay 1 million articles per year just to do China bashing. I mean, it's massive. Yeah, it's massive.
It is.
And, I think when you get to the point where you have to pay negative publicity on your opponent, that's the strategy of someone who's losing. That's a desperate strategy of someone who's losing. Because if you're a winner, you can play with the same tools. It's market economy. The problem is that China is winning with Western tools. Think about it. China is applying market economy tools, capitalist, to beat the collective West at its own game. And so the collective West is not winning. Let's find other solution. Let's destroy China or opponents, but let's not fight, with unfair game.
Yeah, exactly. That's actually a really important point to make. That if you really were, the West fashions themselves as superior to all else, but look at how they conduct themselves, and look at all the nasty little things they have to do. If you are truly superior, you just let the facts speak for themselves. You wouldn't have to invest millions and millions to try to influence countries, because your success would be all the influence you would need to convince other people that your way is the best way. This is why the US is going nuts, because that is exactly what China is doing. People want to work with China. China does not have an organization like the NED buying up media and trying to influence people inside their own country, inside their own political systems. China doesn't do that. I've never seen anyone point out any organization or institution that China has that is doing that. There's nothing like the NED being run by China. And yet so many people want to work with China. And despite the millions and millions the US dumps into trying to brainwash people and influence them, fewer and fewer people want to work with the US. And when you look at these protests anywhere in the world, doesn't matter where, you can see that they really are like the worst people in any given society. In Ukraine, literal Nazis. In Syria, Libya, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. Here in Thailand, they're criminals and traitors. And in China, you saw them. They were all Western. They were all Westernized, and they were in the immediate circles of these Western journalists. You could see that they were all conspiring in the Telegram groups with each other to go out. And we saw how tiny the protests were. It's not even it's such a tiny fraction of 1%, not even close to anything significant. And this is what you see in every single country, despite the US pumping millions and millions of dollars. The elections in Taiwan, I was actually very surprised by that, because the US is extremely invested in Taiwan and manipulating its political system, and yet still. So I mean, that's the proof right there. That even they're cheating and they still can't win. It says a lot. It says a lot, and we're not out of the woods yet. There's still a lot to do. People need to work together. They need to focus on what is multipolarism. Angela, it's just like we always say, we all want a better world. Stop focusing on ideology, on labels, and let's just work together on basic things we all want. That's what multipolarism is about. It's not about imposing your system on someone else. You have your system, I have my system. Is there some common ground that we can share and work together on? And the answer is, for most countries, yes. And it's the US that's getting into the middle of this, trying to put sand in the gears and grind everything to a halt. This is why we do what we do. We've seen firsthand, Angelo, you in Hong Kong, me here in Bangkok, we've seen firsthand the results of US meddling, deadly results, dangerous, destructive results of US meddling. We want to speak up against this, and we want to promote multipolarism, peace, stability, prosperity. I want to thank everyone. We're way over an hour. I want to thank everyone for joining us on this Friday evening. Angelo, thank you for taking time out of your Friday evening to join us on this live stream. please check the video description below. We put all the links that we were citing there in the video description. There's also ways you can find and follow Angelo's work. He's on Twitter, he's on YouTube. Other platforms you can find my work on are also listed there. I don't monetize YouTube. There is no super chat. So if you want to support the New Atlas, there are options there in the video description to do so. And until next time, bye for now.